So there's the mic. Do you have the mic? Oh, you got the mic.
Yeah.
So got the mic source, and then there's the audio source, the loud. So it should be hooked up to the laptop.
Okay, so if I play. Oh, there it is. Hold on. Hold on.
Something's playing, I
Yeah,
think.
it's there. It's just low.
Just so I get to fill this out and sign.
Yeah,
As a release,
sure.
we're allowed to film you.
Do I want to sign this?
It's up to you. If you don't want to be filmed, it makes my job much easier.
I know next semester, Paul's like, yeah, I'm telling my people not to.
Oh, really?
He's like, you tend to talk or you don't see it.
Alright, and so do you know how to unmute your other mic if you want it to come out of the speakers?
No.
The other mic. Wait, that's
Now you're live.
Now I'm live.
Not
Okay.
tap it? Okay. Perfect. That's for the last one. So that one's going and that one's going.
So, for now, until we start.
Yeah, so that's for the lapel mic.
Okay.
And then that one there is your computer source volume.
Right, but I can still control some of the volume there. I assume.
I put it up loud on there, so.
Pronouncing this. Is it Nona Tukavit?
It's like Nuna, not Nana.
Nuna.
Nuna Tukavit.
Okay. Noon, like the hour.
Yeah.
Noon. Do you
Yeah.
have a pen handy? If not, I'll find
No,
it.
I actually don't have a pen handy, sorry.
So online, there's like 10 different ways people pronounce it.
Yeah,
Even
well,
on
there's different
websites.
dialects. So it's Inuit, and there's different dialects
Right.
according to the region.
Okay. So I figured I would check. There's this one website where you can listen to it in 5 different like inflections, including like an Indian accent or a British accent, and then
Oh,
it's like, I don't know
interesting.
how helpful this is. There's none in like the actual people.
Inuit.
Yeah, because they have these automated things that read based on like phonetics. So there you go. Okay.
Oh, I like that you're talking about this.
Yes.
You can point to my computer.
Part of your. Oh, nice. There you go. Is that pink or is it clear?
It's like a chrome.
Oh, that works very well.
Yeah. Hold on. Oh. Okay.
Yeah. I bumped into the other day.
Oh my god. I wish today was Friday. I wish today was Friday. Not for the next 50 minutes, but after it, then it is. Then we live in like it's Friday. Pardon? My title's what? Oh, thank you. I think you'd be like, it's spelled wrong. Yeah, I know.
Does anyone give a cue or should I just start?
I think you.
After 2:30?
Yeah, I think you would just start introducing. Yeah.
Should I give it a couple minutes?
No, I think we could start now. Actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much died down in terms of traffic. So.
Looks like perfume there. This bottle of water.
I know everyone thinks it's vodka, but
I'm not asking.
it's a water bottle from New York.
Okay.
It's legit.
Okay. Is there a microphone or anything?
Oh, I don't know about like a handheld. I just have the. You might have to ask Dave. You might need to just talk really loudly. Just project.
Thank you all very much for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Aimee Batcock. She originally came to us from Labrador, which she's showing off in the front of her laptop with a beautiful sticker there. For her undergrad, she completed a Bachelor's of Science with honors from Bishop's University, where she graduated in 2012, working on a thesis exploring emotion in choral singing. She spent a year at McGill taking more music psychology courses before she arrived here at McMaster in 2014. She started using that background in musical emotion and song to both sing in the university choir and lead this very interesting program of research looking at emotion in music composed by history. She's presented some earlier versions of this work at several conferences, including SMPC, support her work, including the Harvey Longboat Aboriginal Graduate Scholarship, the Nuna Tuvaka, Nuna Tukovic, Community Council, and Inspire Post-Secondary Program Awards. And she's been active in off-campus activities like organizing the Cerebral Coffee House. On campus, she's been a frequent guest lecturer in music theory courses. She supervised nearly 24 undergraduate QQ students and several thesis students in the Maple Lab. So it's been great working with Aimee for what is now, I guess, 5 years. Hard to believe. I've been learning a lot about her native homeland of Labrador, seeing her bond with all her fellow lab mates, and I've spent several years trying to understand her love of fluorescent colors, which she has not maybe fully brought me around to, but will make an appearance in the talk later on. So please join me in welcoming Aimee Batcock.
Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. And before I started, I actually wanted to thank the Colloquium Committee for allowing me to present today and taking up a colloquium spot. As a grad student in this department throughout the years, some of my favorite colloquium speakers have been those of the senior grad students for a number of reasons. You get to see what your colleagues have been working on for these number of years. You get to see the progression of their research, maybe their research story. And definitely as a previously young grad student in the department, it was really inspiring to see these senior grad students, be such great science communicators and know that basically through their years in this department, they've had a lot of opportunities to sort of grow in their skills as communicators and to hope that that one day could be me. So hopefully I can live up to that in this colloquium today, but we'll see. And with that, let's actually talk about some research. So what I'm going to be speaking to you today is what I've been working on in my dissertation over the last few years, which focuses on perceived emotion in music. And the emotional power of music is a large part of why we engage with it so frequently in everyday lives. It's why we, select for specific music in important social situations, why we might play a song on repeat for hours on end. And music has this great ability to transmit emotion to us through the acoustic components that make up this auditory signal. We can feel emotion from music, but we can also just perceive or recognize that a song might sound happy or a song might sound sad. And this is called conveyed emotion. Just to hit that point home about conveyed emotion and the difference between feeling it and perceiving it, because this is the focus of my talk, you can kind of compare it to when we're having a conversation with someone and we're basically using different facial features to cue us to how this person is feeling. They're frowning, so maybe they're sad, they seem sad, or they look sad. You can do the same thing in music with the acoustic information. Now, the process of communicating emotion in music can occur through a chain, essentially, of communication. So we can start here with a composer who's going to select for certain cues to try and convey an expression or intended emotion. So they create their score or the piece that features this musical structure. And then we have a performer who's going to read this musical score and interpret it and decide what do they want to express from it. So they manifest the music or the sound, which is then received by the listener who has to pay attention to this music, has to decode the cues that are within and try and understand what's being conveyed. Now, just I guess a caveat to this is that I'm talking about this kind of in a very straightforward, linear fashion. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes the performer is the composer, or sometimes the listener is the composer. I'm not speaking to that today, but just for the purposes of this talk and sort of going through the influences that might occur at each of these sort of sections or components, I just adopted this basic sort of framework to talk about it. Okay, so as I mentioned, a composer creates the structural map or score, selects 4 musical features that are going to basically create this expression or emotional message. So what are some of the features that are important, or what are some of the features that we as listeners use to perceive what's being conveyed? First off, our ability to discern emotion from these auditory cues is often hypothesized to emerge from our ability to do so with speech. In speech, we have many acoustic cues that are able to communicate meaning to us independent of verbal comprehension. And this is really important because in social contexts, in our everyday life, we have to be able to respond accordingly to someone and sort of navigate the social world. So like speech, music is another acoustic medium that comprises of these auditory features that we can use to understand or decode emotion. And there are actually some similar features that are important for conveying and perceiving emotion in speech as there is in music, or in music as there is in speech, I should say. So for example, timing and pitch are common across music and speech. Timing here refers to the temporal unfolding of events. And within studies of music and emotion literature, we find that pieces that are faster in tempo tend to be perceived as happier, whereas those pieces that are slower in tempo tend to be perceived as sadder. With pitch, this is another cue that's shared between music and speech. Within music, specifically, pitch can refer to the perceptual property of sound that allows us to identify whether tones are high or low. It's found to be important in research for perceiving emotion, where those higher octaves are perceived to be happier and the lower octaves of pitch are perceived to be sadder. So these were 2 cues that we've been interested in studying with respect to that relationship between how these cues are used and how listeners are using them to perceive emotion. There was another cue we were interested in exploring the effect of, and this was unique to music, so we don't see this in speech, and this was mode. And mode is considered to be a type of scale coupled with a set of characteristic melodic behaviors. In Western music, oftentimes pieces or songs are written to be in major or minor modes. If you haven't heard that terminology before, that's okay. You've definitely encountered these 2 different types of scales in your everyday music listening. And I actually have an example that I'll play for you just so you get a sense about this difference. So this is Happy Birthday, and this is the major version. So this is the one that we typically sing and we hear quite often. Now this is Happy Birthday in a minor version. Oh, the suspense was built for that. So hopefully I think you could probably even hear just with that example the difference in the emotion that's possibly conveyed here with those 2 different modes. So again, mode is unique to music, and the influence of major versus minor modes, particularly in Western culture music, is found that major modes or pieces in major modes are perceived with more positively valenced emotions. So things like happiness. So again, that's that regular happy birthday, something that's bright and happy. And those pieces that are in minor modes are related with the more negatively valenced emotions, so sadness, fear, and anger. And again, I think you could hear that in the second version of Happy Birthday. It's a little ominous. You wouldn't want to play that if you were trying to celebrate your friend, I don't think. Now, foundational work in this field has looked at these 3 cues, and it's often focused on the cues in musical melodies or excerpts that are sort of single line melodies, so a little more basic, or they've experimentally manipulated these cues. As well, there's been research that's looked at more complex music examples, those that have 2 lines of music sort of occurring simultaneously. We call this polyphonic music. This tends to be instrumental music that's from film soundtracks. There's also been some pop music that's been used in these studies, as well as classic music examples that are selected because they are sort of strongly conveying a particular emotion. So for our research, we were interested in assessing how these cues work together to communicate emotion, but in the context of Bach's well-tempered clavier. And for this, we thought this would be a good musical control for us for a number of reasons. First off, for a large majority of our studies, we use untrained listeners. So something like Bach's well-tempered clavier would not be very familiar to these listeners. It's also balanced in terms of mode. So there are 48 pieces, 24 of which are in the major mode, 24 of which are in the minor mode. And it really provided us this opportunity to empirically study a musical work that contains cues that might vary together. So within this work, again, this is where we have 2 lines of music happening at the same time, so this polyphonic work. And this would allow us to be able to complement what's been previously done with these cues, with these other types of stimuli that I've mentioned. So I should also make note here that the 3 cues we were looking at had been previously coded by an undergrad in the lab for our excerpts. For us, timing was quantified or defined as attack rate, and this was note attacks per second. Modality was coded as major or minor, and then pitch for us was quantified as pitch height, which was just the mean pitch height of our excerpts that we used. Now, to quantify emotion in our studies, we took a dimensional approach. And what I mean by that is we quantified emotion based on their placement along 2 dimensions. One of the most popular models of this is Russell's circumplex model, which you see here. And this basically breaks down emotion into dimensions of valence, so that's how positive or negative something sounds, and then arousal, which is like the energy of the emotion, so we have the high or low. So just to sort of give you an example of where some emotions might fall in the circumplex model, something that would be positive valence and high arousal might be happiness or excitedness. Something that's positive valence but low in arousal would be something more serene or calm. Low arousal, negative valence, sad or sadness. And negative valence, high arousal would be something like anger. Okay, so for our study, we had 30 non-musician participants, and what I mean by that is they had less than 1 year of formal music training. They came into the lab, they listened to the excerpts of the well-tempered clavier. These excerpts were 8 musical measures in length, so we weren't playing them the full piece, which is probably for the best because that would have taken forever. And after each excerpt played, we asked them to rate perceived emotion on scales of valence and arousal. So after each excerpt, these 2 scales popped up, with the left one here being valence on a scale from 1 to 7, with 1 being negative and 7 being positive, and then a more fine-grained scale here for arousal, with 1 being low and 100 being high. Okay, so we wanted to know which of our 3 cues were important for listener ratings of emotion, particularly along these 2 dimensions. Would we see similar patterns as what we've previously seen in research? So using linear regression analyses, we were able to determine what cues were significant predictors to listener ratings. And for perceived arousal, we found that only our timing cue of attack rate emerged as a significant predictor. So suggesting here that listeners are using this timing information when making their assessments of the energy of the emotion they're perceiving, and less so with the information that's transmitted by mode or pitch. For valence ratings, we saw something different. So for the ratings of perceived valence, we saw all 3 cues were significant predictors here, so suggesting that listeners might be sort of decoding these 3 cues when, they're rating how positive or negative something is sounding. Now, as I mentioned, our stimuli that we're using is a little bit complex in the sense that we have those two lines of music occurring simultaneously, and we wanted to take this analysis a step further and not just sort of rely on these regression results of just what is a significant predictor or not, but we actually wanted to look at the relative weights of these cues and how much do these cues actually contribute to our model, or what are they predicting. So we did that using something called Commonality Analysis, which basically is variance partitioning within your regression model. It's something that's been done before in ecological data in education research or sociological research, so we thought it would be interesting to apply that here and basically break down what's happening with the weights of our cues. So commonality analysis, as I mentioned, breaks down the R-squared of your regression model. So the R-squared being, how much variance your model actually predicts or explains. It breaks down or partitions it into two different types of variance. We have unique variance, which represents what your predictor is independently and uniquely explaining or predicting in your model. And then the shared variance, which represents the variance or contribution between two of your predictors that they have in common with a dependent variable, which is a little confusing. But basically, if you have any sort of correlation between your predictors, this is where you're going to see some shared variance in your model here. So just kind of walking through this image a little bit, the red circle you see here, the Y, represents sort of 100% of the variance. Here we have three predictors, A, B, and C, and those predictors have some overlapping or non-overlapping regions, where those non-overlapping regions represents the unique variance that they're explaining, and the shared or the overlapping regions represent the shared variance. So in the context of this research, it might look a little something like this. So we have, again, our timing cue of attack rate, modality, and pitch height. So we broke down each of these sections using commonality analysis to get a better sense not only about the relative contribution of each cue, but how that sort of compares or stacks up when we're looking at unique versus shared variance. And we put these into bar graphs, so you won't have to look at a bunch of Venn diagrams, I promise you. So starting with arousal ratings, we have our cues along the x-axis with our unique variance here represented by the cues alone or independently. And then we have the different cue combinations which represent the shared combinations. We have the amount of variance that's being predicted on the y. And then just to remind us, when it came to our regression results, we found that for perceived arousal, only our cue of timing attack rate was a significant predictor. So basically, if we think about what we might see with commonality analysis, it would just simply be that attack rate is going to predict for essentially most of the variance in the model, if not all. So what do we see? Well, when we look at the unique contributions of the cues in our model, we see just that. So attack rate predicts roughly 30%. Modality or mode is not really doing very much, and pitch height is very negligible. And that's what we would have expected. When looking at the shared contributions of the cues, this is what we see, and what I'll sort of draw your attention to, that's, I guess, the most important here, is the relationship between attack rate and mode here. It's predicting for a good chunk of the variance. And what we think is happening here is that specifically within our stimuli, there is a relationship where major pieces that are in major modes are faster than those in minor modes, which is very common in Western culture music as well. Composers tend to structurally combine these two cues in their compositions. Okay, so what about perceived valence? And this might be a little bit more interesting for us because we saw in the regression model, all three cues were significant predictors. So we have it set up the exact same way. Again, cues on our x, variance on our y. What we see when we look at the unique contribution is that all three cues are predicting some amounts of variance, but attack rate and modality seem to be predicting more than pitch height. And they also seem to be predicting similar amounts. So they seem to be doing the heavy lifting in our model, or maybe more important or informative for our listeners. When we look at the cue combinations or the shared variance, what I'll point to bring your attention to, again, is this relationship between attack rate and mode, which really is predicting a lot of the variance for valence ratings here. And again, that has to do with the fact that the major mode pieces were faster than the minor. So commonality analysis is really useful in this case because we can get a little bit more detail from the regression results and really see what's sort of happening in terms of the relative cue weights of our predictors. Okay, so just to summarize that first part, when we're talking about the energy of an emotion that's being conveyed in music and we're perceiving it as a listener, we find that timing is a very important cue to be able to tell if something is sort of high energy or low energy. In contrast, when we're looking at trying to assess how positive or negative something sounds, all three cues here were significant predictors, so they seem to have some useful information to make this judgment. But when we looked at commonality analysis, we got a bit more detail of a picture, which suggests that maybe mode and timing are more important than a cue of pitch, for example. Okay, so we talked a little bit about so the importance of some select cues and how they're used by a listener to perceive emotion, but what about the influence of a performer? What effect of performer interpretation occurs for perceived emotion? Well, interpretation is pivotal for a music performance. It's one of the dimensions to which musicians are often evaluated on, whether it be musical performances, recordings, juries, etc. And these interpretations arise when performers have specific intentions to, express an emotion or just be really expressive emotionally. And they make these artistic decisions where they have to, manipulate what cues are available to them in order to manifest or make that interpretation into the finished product that is the music or the sound. Therefore, the expressive choices that are made by a performer not only represent an artist's individuality, but can have huge implications on the listener's experience of music. So they ultimately decide, what are we actually going to hear. Luckily, as well, we as listeners are we are sensitive to these differences, I should say. We can recognize individual changes in dynamics, so that's sort of how soft or how loud you're playing some notes, as well as musical ornamentation, so that's like the little flourishes you can add when you're playing music. We can also be accurate in identifying a performer's expressive style, just simply based on some timing information like tempo. And it's because of this variation in expression and our sort of awareness or sensitivity to it that, when the same song is performed or interpreted by two performers, it might actually sound completely different. One might be, more emotional or sound more emotional than another. We might love one over the other. An example of this difference of interpretation could be with Leonard Cohen's version of Hallelujah versus Jeff Buckley's version of Hallelujah, which I will also play a little clip.
There was a secret chord that did play and please the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do you?
And then Jeff Buckley's version. Okay, I think we get the picture with that. So we were interested in studying this idea about performer interpretation and the differences that happen with different interpretation, and basically how those differences might influence how we as listeners use cues when perceiving emotion. Now, lucky for us, the well-tempered clavier has actually been performed or recorded by a number of different performers across many years and even on different instruments. So we thought this would be, again, a great thing to use to study interpretation. Now, based off of a previous corpus analysis that looked at several recordings of the well-tempered clavier, we actually selected 7 notable piano performers. You might have heard of some of them, Glenn Gould, for example, Frederick Goulda, Edwin Fischer, as well as a few more. And I actually have some more music examples of two of the performers that, again, we used in our study and their interpretation of the prelude in C minor in the well-tempered clavier. So this is Frederick Golda's version. And then turn this down. This is Edwin Fischer's. Okay, so for our paradigm for this study, we had, again, non-musician participants come in, listen to excerpts of the well-tempered clavier here by one performer, and then we had them retrospectively rate the perceived emotion again along our two dimensions, so valence and arousal. And as I mentioned, we were interested with this study in looking at whether or not there were any trade-offs in the cue weights, basically based on different interpretations or performances. So just to talk about the regression results really quickly, we found essentially the same thing that we found with the first study that I showed you. So in terms of ratings of perceived arousal, only attack rate significantly predicted the listener ratings. And for perceived valence, we saw all three cues. For all of the performers could predict how listeners were responding to these excerpts. But what's more interesting, again, is looking at the commonality analysis and seeing if there were any of the cue trade-offs based on interpretation. So set up the same way that we've seen before, cues on the X, our variance on the Y. Here we have different performers represented by different colors. It is very colorful. It's a lot for your eyes to take in. You may not believe me, but R chose those colors by default. I just haven't changed them yet. So what do we see when we look at the sort of cue profile for perceived arousal rating? Yeah, there's a lot, I'm sorry. But what I'm just gonna sort of get you to focus on for right now is specifically with attack rate. And then you can see that there's some variation happening here. So there are some differences for the predictive weight of attack rate, which suggests that for some performers, their timing information is more predictive of listener ratings or judgments of arousal. For example, this light green here is Goulda, this purple is Richter, so there's quite a difference there. And then I should say that just because Goulda is so low doesn't mean he was slow and doesn't mean people thought he was worse. It just means that the perceptual ratings were less dependent upon his tempi than, let's say, other performers. So it could be the case that there are other cues that some of these performers are using that they're maybe emphasizing more, that listeners are relying on or using to decode emotion. These regression models were very limited with how many cues we had or predictors we had in the model. We only looked at 3, so timing, modality, and pitch. So there could be other cues that are important, like dynamics, again, so how soft or how loud you're playing some of the musical notes. Okay, moving on to valence ratings. Again, set up the same way. What do we see when we look at the commonality analysis or the breakdown of a regression model? We actually don't really see anything, which is fine. That actually kind of makes sense. What this might mean is, or what it might highlight, I should say, is the power of musical structure alone as opposed to interpretation to convey valence. So interpretation differed for the different performers, yet the valence was pretty equally predicted by the models. And this aligns with the research or previous work because it shows that those cues that performers can manipulate or can control, so we call them expressive or performance cues, those cues are found to have a stronger influence on ratings of arousal. And it's the cues that the performers don't have control over, things like mode and pitch, etc., that seem to have a stronger influence on perceived valence. So that might be why we're not really seeing any cue shifts or trade-offs here because of interpretation, because the musical structure alone is enough to predict for how listeners are rating. Okay, so We talked a bit about the structural components that are important to perceive emotion. We just went through a little bit about performer differences and cue trade-offs, where timing information for perceived arousal seems to shift based on interpretation, the predictability, I should say, of that. But what happens when we get to the listener? What are the influences that a listener might bring in this process of perceived emotion? Well, it's important to consider that we as listeners have individual differences, and the influence of individual differences might arise when listeners basically assign or give different meanings to the musical structure, perhaps because of different context, maybe different listening histories, maybe the genre that you're used to listening to uses cues differently to express emotion than someone else, or prior associations. There also is research that looks at the influence of personality, and some of that work shows that there tends to be some correlation between how high you score on the scale of neuroticism and how sad you rate sad music. So the higher you are apparently on the BFI for neuroticism scale, you tend to rate sad music more sad. So one kind of difference that may explain for variation in how listeners perceive emotion might be your level of music training. And formal music training often involves concentrated attention or effort in understanding musical structure or theory. You're also sort of taught techniques in how to use performance or expressive cues in order to express emotion, for example. And evidence shows in general that music training can affect how individuals process musical information, suggesting differences between musical experts or those that have had a lot of music training and those without. So music training has actually been linked to some behavioral or perceptual differences with respect to emotion recognition in both speech and actually music as well. So specifically in speech, we can see there's a benefit of music training for emotion recognition accuracy, where those with music training can more accurately identify appropriate emotional tones across 6 different emotions in this study. In music research, it's shown that years of music training can be found to correlate with emotion recognition accuracy. And then even more recently, there was a study that examined the potential predictors of listener recognition for these emotion perception tasks and found that out of emotional contagion, emotional intelligence, gender, and music training, that only music training appeared to explain for how listeners were doing on these tasks. And with that said, there's also some conflicting evidence or a counter argument against this, which shows that listeners without music training can oftentimes perform just as well or very similar to those with music training. This is across a number of perceptual tasks, which includes emotion recognition. And the argument or the idea behind this is that as listeners gain music knowledge from basic listening experiences, it's possible that music listening alone might be sufficient to create these experienced listeners, to make us really good at decoding this information. And then if you think back to what I mentioned in the beginning about speech, I mean, we do that every day. We talk to people and we have to sort of decode those auditory cues, so we have experience that way as well. So we wanted to look at this question, but kind of come from this idea about listener difference with respect to music training, asking, do listeners with music training use cues differently? So for this study, we had participants with 6 or more years of music training. Again, they came in, listened to these excerpts of the Well-Tempered Clavier, and then retrospectively rated perceived emotion along our 2 scales. So what cues do listeners with music training use, and how does that compare when we look at how the cues are used with untrained listeners? Again, just to go back to the regression results first before jumping into commonality analysis, what we found is what we've been seeing across the board, which is that for perceived arousal, attack rate is significantly predicting for how listeners are rating, and for perceived valence, all 3 cues were significant predictors. Okay, so getting into the more interesting stuff, what do we see when we break down the cue profile with commonality analysis? So again, set up the same way, cues on the X, variance on the Y. We have those with musical training are going to be plotted in the red. and those without music training in the blue. And the data for those without music training comes from the first experiment that I showed you. So we're just plotting this here to compare. Okay, so what do we see? We actually don't see very much difference at all. So it doesn't matter how much music training you have. Attack rate is sort of pretty similarly predicting or doing all of the work in the model and predicting for similar amounts of variance here. Moving on to perceived valence. What does this look like when we break down the commonality analysis of a regression model? And this is what we see. First of all, you'll notice from here on out, it's all the same. But what is more interesting is specifically right here. So for the untrained listeners in the blue, we saw that attack rate and modality predicted similar amounts of unique variance in our model. So they were sort of equally important in that sense. But when we have listeners with music training, there seems to be a shift. So modality is predicting a lot more of the variance here than attack rate is. So maybe they're more sensitive or using this cue more when they're making their assessments of how positive or negative something sounds. And this makes sense, actually, and fits in with the literature because we find that mode isn't a cultured cue. So basically, it's through exposure or experience with how mode is being used that we come to actually be able to use it when perceiving emotions. Developmentally, this is shown where children under the age of 4 rely on timing information when distinguishing between happy and sad. However, after that age, they start to use mode in their judgments to help them differentiate between those two emotions. Okay, so just to summarize that, we asked the question, do listeners with music training use cues differently than those without music training? And what we saw was for perceived arousal ratings, it didn't matter how much music training you had. Attack rate was predicting similar amounts of unique variance in our models, so pretty strong, pretty important. However, for perceived valence, we did see a shift here with how much they were predicting. So for those with no training, timing and mode seem to be pretty on par in terms of their strength or their cue weight. However, when listeners had music training, there was a shift where mode was predicting much more of the variance, suggesting it's more important than attack rate in this context. Okay, so the primary goal of these 3 studies that I've shown you today were to determine and look at the trade-offs in the weighting of cues that convey emotion, taking into account some difficult things to assess, such as individual differences in performer interpretation or listener differences in this context with music training. And something that these studies really emphasize is how cues can impact dimensions of valence and arousal differently. So for our dimension of perceived arousal, again, we only saw attack rate emerge as our predictor for this. So this seems to be what's most important when we're making assessments of the energy of an emotion. However, for perceived valence, we saw all 3 cues were significant predictors. And then we broke that down into commonality analysis. We got a little bit more detail to see that timing and mode seem to predict more than pitch height. So they seem to be more important in this context than pitch. We also looked at the influence of performer interpretation, where we saw specifically for perceived arousal, there seemed to be some differences in the weight of attack rate or how much attack rate predicted listener ratings for different interpretations, which might mean there are other cues that we haven't covered that might sort of predict for some of the other variants. We didn't see any differences in perceived valence, but this makes sense because it is found that the structural information alone tends to have a greater influence on perceived valence. And then finally, looking at listener differences, and here with music training, we didn't see any difference for perceived arousal, but when we looked at valence, we had that difference between mode and timing. And then just to take a step back, and why do we care? Understanding how listeners perceive emotion in music and that relationship between cues and conveyed emotion is really important to help performers or composers create these emotional works. And they really want listeners to engage. They really want you to feel emotionally attached, to like it, to come to their concerts, to buy their CDs. On a different note, understanding music's ability to communicate emotion effectively is important in clinical settings. So particularly those that use populations of individuals who may have difficulty in verbal expression can use some of these practices or techniques to express. Rachel would know more about this, but I know that there's something called the ISO principle in music therapy, where a client is expressing themselves on an instrument, and the music therapist needs to sort of understand what's being expressed, needs to essentially decode those cues, and then respond on the instrument that they're on accordingly, perhaps in an attempt to modulate their mood and shift it away. So awareness or knowledge about how these cues work and how those cues can be used to convey different emotions can be crucial in this context. None of the work that I presented for you today would have been possible without the support of several funding agencies, as well as a very long list of people who've worked in the lab even before I was here, actually. From undergrad students, like QQ students, thesis students, as well as some very important lab mates and grad school colleagues. And then lastly, while I still have your attention, I would like to take a minute to talk about the grad research conference happening December 5th. This is the third year for this event. And I know the committee works hard every year to try and make this event really great. It's something that we want to make a staple in the department, and we really see that it gives a lot of added value to grad school experience in the department. This year, the keynote is given by two wonderful PNB alums who are fantastic presenters, and we'll have some good insight about going from academia to different aspects of industry. Also, just generally speaking, this is a really great event to showcase what you've been working on. Even if you have something that's kind of still in development, but you might want some feedback from your fellow grad students or faculty, or if you want to just simply practice your science communication, this is a great chance to do it. The deadline was extended this week to November 8th, which is tomorrow, so you have time, if you haven't done it yet, to come up with a title and an abstract. You can present a talk, a poster, and new this year we also have the lightning talks, which are very short format talks. So again, if you have something that's maybe still early in development, this is a great chance to present some of your stuff and get some feedback. And then also new this year for this event is the meme competition. So we're accepting memes related to psychology, neuroscience, behavior, as well as respectful memes, but funny memes about the department and grad school life in the department. So for example, you can make a meme about taking a colloquium cookie and not coming to colloquium, which I thank everyone for not doing today. Or you could even meme about that moment in grad stats with Pat, when you realize that you've been far too trusting of the p-value for too long. And then with that said, I would like to thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
I think one of the big questions was to what extent cues are either independent or interactive. So I kind of feel like your work doesn't address that, because using the Bach, there's some, as you mentioned, correlations that are built into the stimulus set. So can you address my concern about the fact that you can't really address whether these cues are acting either independently or interactively? You found the correlation of the Bach,
Yeah, so we did run some regression models that included interaction terms, and actually found that those regression models didn't explain for any much more than just having them as independent predictors. Yeah. No, not at all. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fair. And I mean, we wanted to study something like that because that is experienced quite frequently in our everyday world and across other things beyond music. But yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and a similar concern with using the box is that you can find many things with pitch height.
Yeah.
And I would say that's because, like, given the corpus that you're using, the range of that piece,
Yeah.
all of these are going to be exactly pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Because of the two-handed range.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree with you. And I think one other thing that's a very big limitation is that these are average values as well. And music is a dynamically occurring stimuli, of course. So it would be interesting to look at continual ratings of emotion and as it's progressing through the excerpt. Erica.
Kind of what I was thinking. I was going to just ask what other cues do you think people could be using, such as, how cues might be changing over time, or I know you talked about dynamics, but is there anything else you can maybe say to that? Or like any other cues that you think might be?
I mean, I think there are many, but I don't have any specific to give to you right now. But yeah. Sarah.
Specifically when it comes to like clinical context, which cues do you think would be most important for which population groups, and in terms of like pedagogical, dissemination of this work, how do you think this could translate into something for your music therapist or child speech pathologist working with younger kids?
Yeah, I don't know about specific populations and like what would be best for those. I don't know if Rachel, maybe you have some thoughts on that actually.
The aspect of how you showed the importance of timing, right, in regards to how important that seemed to be for individuals, whether they had music background or not a music background. And so this model of neurologic music therapy is really an entrainment is built all around the importance of tempo. And so that's an area that's been used in for rehabilitation post-stroke, for example. And Parkinson's disease. Yeah. So I think that's supporting evidence for the importance of that.
Yeah, Jess.
I have kind of naive question. So you were measuring rated valence and arousal, and you were using different scales. I'm just wondering why.
Yeah. So perceived valence is usually, at least in the literature, measured with a 7-point Likert scale because you have a neutral essentially in the middle. For arousal, we just wanted something that was more fine-grained, had more of a range essentially to it, than to have, let's say, just like the 7 points for high and low, and yeah. Cam. Not differences between performers. I have like far too many plots for that section. So one thing we did plot was the perceived arousal or valence ratings for each piece, for each performer. It's a lot to look at. Again, it's like the other graphs. Each performer is a different color again, and basically they kind of look like this. And what is interesting is that it does seem to be a piece effect where certain pieces have maybe certain characters that maybe performers might get rated very similarly on perceived arousal or valence, and then there's other ones to which there's more variation, and there's no necessarily specific performer that's always rated high or rated low. There seems to be quite a lot of differences and changes that happen piece by piece. Yeah, Sarah.
Another question. Probably definitely covered this. It just wasn't time to cover this when you were describing how you set up your paradigm. But in terms of polyphony and the level of complexity added to one piece versus another by the degree of polyphony and number of voices going on, is that something you controlled for?
No, but that's actually a really good point. That
complexity could add a lot of
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Yeah, we didn't sort of control or measure that. Yeah. Yes, Laurel.
To follow up on a couple of other questions earlier about other keys that people might use, I just sort of wanted you to think beyond and maybe to the next studies you might run. In terms of models of how emotion is conveyed or expressed or embodied in music, so two basic classes. So one is the kind that has been used anyway in other features. And the other one is more of a sort of David Huron approach of prediction and reaction to prediction. And so that's sort of a whole class that isn't yet in
Yeah, well.
So actually, that's so much. What do you think about that? How could you extend what you've done to test that way of thinking about it?
Yeah, so one thing that was really interesting that we found is that I mentioned how sort of the general rule is the slower tempo is usually perceived as sort of like sad, for example, maybe lower in arousal. But there were actual cases where a performer was slower and actually rated more intense, more arousing. And I think it's that idea about expectation and maybe feeling like somebody is going to be maybe a little late or something like that. So I think that maybe looking at that in terms of what sort of the range of timing and at what point it becomes, an expectation thing of are you going to be late kind of thing, and feeling that to be more intense or arousing could be something interesting to look at. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe I just missed it, but did all of your participants listen to all of the recordings?
No. So they listened to all of the excerpts of one performer. Yeah. Yeah, something for the future would be to pick some select pieces and actually have different performer interpretations of that piece. One reason in which it was done this way at the beginning was just because I think if you were listening to the examples I showed you with, was it Goulda and Fisher? You can kind of hear in the recording that there was a little hissing for Edwin Fisher, so there were some differences in the quality of the recording, things like that that would make putting them all into sort of one study a little difficult because you would have so many things that were different between the recording quality themselves or the instruments themselves. So that would be something to definitely sort of build upon and kind of do a better design of that study. Yeah.
You may have mentioned this earlier, but did any of the participants, did they all tell you they hadn't heard any of the pieces before?
I didn't mention that actually. Yeah. So after the experiment, we did ask all of our participants, do you recognize any of the pieces? If so, what ones? And then, have you played them just in case? Basically, for the untrained listeners, they basically didn't recognize any. If they said they did, and we asked them what ones, they usually said like, oh, I'm sure I've heard that from like the Baby Einstein thing. And I'm like, sure, yeah, sure. For the trained listeners, though, there were, out of our 30, I think 6 people said that they recognized. And I think out of that, there was, maybe say, I think the 6 people who recognized it played some, but they played a max of 3 out of the 48. So that's something else is to consider familiarity in that context, and maybe study different genre of music that's not something that they're necessarily sort of like directly trained in. Yeah. Yeah, Chantal.
Do you think if you introduce a visual cue where they could see the performer playing the music, if people would start to rely on like body language and stuff?
I think that can definitely play a huge role, especially with perceived arousal. Yeah. Because, I mean, if you listen to a recording versus you're at someone's concert, I mean, I know there's a social experience to that as well, but I think that actually seeing a performance plays a huge role in your perception of that musical experience in general. Yeah. Okay. Well, there is a wine and cheese upstairs, so if you have any more time, feel free to join me.